Hello, everybody. I'm very excited to be here today, and it's nice to see so many of you again after seeing you last night in under 12 hours. We're seeing each other twice. And the topic I'm going to be talking about today has basically taken over a lot of my performance and research life for about the last 2 years since I first started playing and discovering Bernstein. So I'm very excited to share with you my own excitement and basically what I've been doing for the last 2 years. And before I start, I want to take a chance to just really thank everybody here in this room that you see with badges and behind desks, especially Mark Horowitz and Dr. David Plylar, who were emailing me consistently and are a big reason of why I'm here today. If you haven't been here enough, please just keep coming to the library. The staff here is so kind and really makes research not only easy, but a lot of fun as well. So I know that we contextualized a little bit with the first lecture today, but I have a little bit of other tidbits I'd like to share with you. And I found for myself when I was going through all this research, no matter what phase I was at, it was really helpful for me to consistently go back and think about the biographical attributes to give myself a little bit of a basis and remind myself where I was coming from. So Leonard Bernstein was a Jewish American, which even though I don't know if that's going to be discussed a lot today, it was very critical. We just talked about politics, but his religious influence is extremely potent in a lot of his works, especially in Mass. And I would suggest, if you're really interested in this, to go to the National Museum of American Jewish History. They have a really wonderful exhibition going on right now that I was just at because they're using some of my music for it. And it was so cool, so I would highly recommend looking into that. More specific to what we're discussing today is that up until the 1930s, Leonard Bernstein was not being educated in music except for just what he was exposed to through the radio. And this is very interesting when you think about in today's world, especially the leading musicians, pianists, we all start training at around age 2 or 3. And Bernstein was born in 1918, and he didn't even have his first piano lesson until 1932 with Helen Coates at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, as was documented here in the library. And so it's important to think about that, he heard the radio and his Victrola phonograph, and so he, as a young child, didn't really hear a difference between high art and low art, which was a very big discussion during the time of that jazz wasn't considered as scholarly as classical, or folk music, was on the radio, and novelty tunes like Kitten on the Keys. And you hear a lot of these songs coming through actually in his piano works, which you're going to hear today. And also, if you haven't been exploring Leonard Bernstein like those of us that are speaking today, you probably would recognize him from young people's concerts or from his Harvard lectures called The Unanswered Question. And these are very important to always reflect on because they actually focus on a lot of the issues that we study in depth now as researchers, going from what is American music to what is musical syntax to what is ambiguity to what is music. And that's a very hard question to unpack, especially in a room full of 5-year-olds. So when you think about how he really tackled this and presented it to the public, to me that's the most meaningful thing, is that throughout his own life, he didn't claim that he had the answer. Instead, he constantly reached out to the community to say, what do you think? This is what I've discovered through music, but let's have a dialogue about this. And if you are still getting to know some of his music, it's always important to remember that he was the one that wrote West Side Story and On the Town, and that he was most known for being a conductor. So this is where we're kind of going to take our next pivotal point, is that a lot of times to the public, he's most remembered for his conducting and leadership and famous show tunes. But a lot of times if you say, who was Leonard Bernstein, someone wouldn't necessarily say, oh, he was a great pianist. So the objectives today are I want to give you a fresh perspective on Leonard Bernstein from a pianist viewpoint. Because it was really a fresh discovery for myself that I had when I came here for the first time. I want you to ponder with Leonard Bernstein the identity of American music. What is it that makes music American? And it's harder than you may think to put your finger on, but he talks a lot about this in his dissertation, which we'll talk a little bit about. And also just the sustainability of repertoire. So this goes beyond Bernstein. Why is it that Beethoven and Mozart are more household names rather than Hindemith and Stravinsky? And why is it that some of Leonard Bernstein's music, like West Side Story, is known to everybody, but his piano sonata was basically unknown even to his own children until the last few years? I want you to have an even deeper experience of what you can access here and touch with your own hands. I was astounded with what I actually found. And through all of this, we're going to talk a lot about Bernstein's deeper compositional style and process, and even you'll hear some performances of unpublished piano music that exists here. So what originally led me here was I was going through the library stacks at the Juilliard Library, and I found a book that had his piano sonata, and I said, wait, he wrote a piano sonata? I've been playing piano for 18 years, and how did I never know this? Because I love this composer, and I would have wanted to play this. And I realized that we never really see pianists performing Bernstein in solo concerts, save for maybe a few anniversaries as an encore, but we never really see it programmed front and center like we do Liszt Sonata or a Beethoven Sonata. And beyond that, the reason I also wasn't unaware of it is that in piano literature courses where pianists are educated as to the repertoire for their instrument, I had never been told that Leonard Bernstein had solo piano music except for a few anniversaries. So those questions were really interesting to me of why is this that we kind of gloss over his entire piano repertoire? And so at first I thought, well, maybe there just isn't that much there, which, as you will see today, is far from true. But also, a lot of his musical material from his piano works is reused. So it's reused in everything from orchestral things, from symphonies to Broadway shows to song cycles. So when you look at the earlier piano music, you may think, oh, well, maybe it was just a sketch, especially since my second point is that they're all very short. A lot of the piano music, except for maybe 2 or 3 pieces, often does not span more than about 2 or 3 pages. So it's very easy for people to kind of regard them more as sketches or little vignettes rather than substantial independent repertoire. And beyond this, when you look at the piano music, a lot of times with the groupings, they're not meant to be intended to be performed as complete cycles that have inherent musical material, but rather just kind of as publications where I'm going to throw all these pieces together so that I have a set of 13 anniversaries. And even though some sets, I will say from my research, have a little bit more going on in terms of fluidity, the 13 anniversaries is a very wonderful example of how much of a hodgepodge it really was of him just throwing stuff together. So I wanted to share with you my first impression of when I came here to the Library of Congress, because I thought from the extensive finding aid of, I think it's close to 800 pages long, that I went through page by page, that I knew exactly what I was going to find. And that was far from the case. You can ask any one of the librarians that saw my face on the first day that after my first 8 hours, my eyes were out of my head because of all the new stuff that I found and all the things that I had no idea that existed. And the first thing I want to talk about is just the amount of correspondence that's there. You can sit for hours and see letters from anybody to Leonard Bernstein, whether it's Copland, JFK that we just talked about, or even Michael Jackson. And what was really poignant to me about the Copland letters is I knew that it was going to be a lot about friendship, but they actually discussed in depth what does it mean to be an artist. And so being an artist myself, it was really engaging to read that. I wanted to actually read you a letter from President JFK that I didn't know that after going and seeing the White House and being a little bit of a tourist for a couple hours, I thought, I'll never be able to actually touch anything that a president touched because, it's all under high security. And there I was sitting at a table holding a letter from JFK on presidential stationery. And it was a little bit of an overwhelming experience. I tried not to cry on the letter. But what he said is Bernstein, I am hopeful that this collaboration between the government and arts will continue and prosper. Mrs. Kennedy and I would be particularly interested in any suggestions you may have in the future about the possible contributions the national government might make to the arts in America. So not only was Bernstein extremely influential in New York about what pieces got played in the New York Philharmonic and which composers made it to the top or not, but the president was actually saying, please tell us, where do you see the arts going in America? So when you really look at the art scene today, it's in large part shaped by Leonard Bernstein's choices about what he wanted American music to become in this century where it was really beginning to be defined as an American art form. And of course, if you want to see Michael Jackson as a young person writing a letter, there is a letter in silver Sharpie on black letterhead saying, you know, I love you, Leonard Bernstein. I hope I can be like you one day. Editing is really interesting. In a lot of these pre-concert talks we've been having, we talk about how, you know, he slaved over things and threw things out, and there's a lot of different forms. But that's only the case when he does larger orchestrations. When you look at his piano works and some of his other instrumental works, there's almost no editing. It's very Mozartian, where you could tell he basically knew exactly what the music was going to sound like in his head and just wrote it out without any editing. And so that was a really interesting topic to explore as a researcher, to see when he edits and when he does not. The absorption of race elements into American music is his Harvard dissertation. And he basically talks about how American music is special because there is no folk music in America. The closest we can get is jazz, but unlike all these other cultures, we're so heterogeneous that we combine all these different cultures into one. So how do you do that musically? And so he uses jazz and Latin rhythms kind of as the core point, which you can think of in any piece that he has ever written. You hear that da-da-da-da-da-da, you know, and it comes back again and again. And so having read that before coming to the archive was very cool because I got to see the progression of that. Today we're going to be talking about recycling, about how he reuses music for this or that play. I'm sure throughout the last 2 days you've heard the same tunes and you're like, wait, I thought that was in Songfest. Wait, I thought that was here. And that's the case. And a lot of times it was intentional, but a lot of times it was actually more convenient because of a deadline. And of course, all this has to do with the compositional process we'll discuss. Which leads us to his earliest piano music, which a lot of this I was unaware existed until my last few years of exploring, including his first piano concerto. I had no idea, and it was called The Russian Gypsy War. And it was written in 1935, so again, to contextualize, he didn't have his first piano lesson until 1932. And here he is writing a grandiose piano concerto. Unfortunately, it is not complete, which makes every pianist sob. But it's spanning almost 50 pages already, even though it's incomplete. And it's, you know, there's writing that looks, if you just see this little excerpt here, he has sweeping arpeggios in octaves. So it's very much like a Tchaikovsky concerto or a Schumann concerto. You can see here it's in two piano forms, so the little Roman numerals indicate one piano and then another piano playing the orchestra part. But it was just so remarkable to me that within 3 years he goes from one of the largest compositional styles on the instrument. And we are pretty sure that this came before what's known as his first composition, which was a beautiful little voice and piano piece in 1935 called Psalm 148. But we're hoping that we can try to keep finding the pages of this concerto because it's really fun. And so now, the first piece that I explored, I want to explore a couple of pieces with you today to show you not only how it affects me as a pianist playing the score and making sure it's accurate, but also it really tells you a lot about who Bernstein was as a composer, how he thought, and also how he interacted with people and deadlines and all of these other things that make humans human. So Non Troppo Presto is his first complete solo piece that we do have in completion, and it wasn't published until 2011, if you can believe that or not. And so, of course, I saw that it was recycled and on the town, so I wanted to see if he knew it was going to be recycled or if there was any significance. So I went and I started searching for this manuscript, and I couldn't find it. And I went crazy, and I went through folders and folders and folders, and eventually I get this pile of in a box, and it's unmarked, and all of a sudden I open it, and lo and behold, there's an earlier version of this manuscript that was not in the finding aid quite yet. And the only reason that I started pairing it together with this now unknown chamber set was by matching wine stains. And you can see that over on the table, is that it has wine stains. And so what I found is Non Troppo Presto, even though there's a version that exists that you'll also see on the table that's complete and it's very clean, it's meant for a gift for Mildred, is that it had an earlier form, and it was actually part of a larger set that's not complete, unfortunately, yet. And the piece prior to it was called Interlude, and it had music that was going to be used in Age of Anxiety, of all things. And then this piece, and it was marked Presto. And so it looked like it was going to be for chamber ensemble because he kind of had a little flute and cello scratched in there. But it's a really cool thing to realize that there are sets that we don't even know exist quite yet that are starting to come out of this archive. And now, how does it really influence how we think about cataloging all this? Well, Jack Gottlieb was one of the great scholars on Bernstein, and in the publication you'll see that he thought it was probably Music for the Dance #1, because there is a published Music for the Dance #2, which contains a series of dances. So we knew there was a Music for the Dance #1 because it's in all of his earliest piano programs. So he did a lot of piano programs at the beginning of his life. Again, remember, he only started piano lessons in 1932, and now he's performing already. But Music for the Dance #1 had two pieces on these programs that we found, Allegretto and Vivacissimo. And so, of course, we want to know what were these sets that he played. This was his first time as a pianist ever performing his own works for the public, so it would be really, really crucial for us to understand what his earliest compositions sounded like. And unfortunately, I found a very interesting trend in Bernstein's music, and so this is kind of keeping in mind with when he edits and when he doesn't edit. One thing he never edits is his tempo markings. Almost every time that he writes a piece, no matter what ensemble it is, he doesn't really change the tempo. He might give more description, so if something's presto, he may say non troppo presto, meaning not as much presto. But he wouldn't actually change the word presto to allegro or to andante or any other word. He would keep consistent. And also I noticed that he was performing Music for the Dance in 1938, which was after he had already completed Non Troppo Presto. So sadly, Jack Gottlieb's guess kind of goes out the window because Bernstein all of a sudden was still performing these other sets. But what's interesting about these discoveries and correlating all these things is that now we can try to say, well, what other piece in the whole entire archive has the title Allegretto on it or Vivacissimo? And there's only one other solo piano piece that has Allegretto, which is For Aaron Copland. It's a very famous anniversary. And so my hypothesis is that actually may have been part of this early set, especially since For Aaron Copland also went through a manifestation of being part for a partita for piano, so a dance cycle. So fun things like this can help us completely rethink Bernstein's earliest musical compositions. And I want to now play for you Non Troppo Presto. And I want you, to me, I've always thought about this piece being like the Minute Waltz of Chopin meets Kitten on the Keys, or Dizzy Fingers by Zez Comfrey. Isn't that a fun piece? I love it. So now we're going to get into Bernstein's largest works for the piano and his beginning of doing publications, which are the Sonata for Piano and the 7 Anniversary Collection. So at least the 7 Anniversaries is more familiar to us since it's more often performed, but a Sonata for the Piano. And the Sonata for Piano was written in 1938, so very early on. And actually, I just recently discovered in the last few months it may have actually been 1937. That's still to be uncovered a little bit. But it's in 2 movements, and it's bookended. So it starts with this very large march, and then it ends the same way. But what's so cool about this piece from his Harvard days is that he incorporates every single thing you can read in his dissertation in this piece. So in the 20th century, composers were going in different routes. So there were some that were neoclassicist, so trying to look back and incorporate sonata form and fugues and trying to sound like composers past. And then there were others that said we want to break from all tradition and we want to do chance music, or we want to do things like 12-tone or serialism where everything is very mathematically organized and perfect. So the list goes on and on. But just in this Sonata for Piano in the first movement, which you will hear today, he applies set theory, meaning he could only use a certain amount of notes in any given phrase, and he could not go outside of that. So it sounds very, to use Jamie Bernstein's word, pointy and interesting. He uses unmetered music, which means that there actually is no time signature, and he just indicates for the pianist to play it whenever they feel is correct musically. Rumba rhythm, which is kind of that rhythm we talked about, that very Latin rhythm that he felt was so important to American music. Elements of jazz. And even in the second movement, which we don't have time for today, but I urge you to listen to, we then go back into more of a neoclassicist thing where we hear developing variation, which was a technique used by Brahms and Liszt, and even a fugue. So here's the first movement of his Sonata for Piano. fun piece. And what I love is even though it's very, heady and it's not really as tuneful as other things, you can hear kind of this West Side Story thing come out in the middle. And the second movement is just as eerie and deep and interesting. So I really urge you to listen to the whole sonata. The partita for piano. So when I first saw this in the finding aid, I got so excited because I thought, oh, a partita, meaning, this in the Baroque era, it was this dance suite of pieces that were all different types of Baroque dance, so they were all metered and had a particular feel. And so I was so excited that I was going to have a new set to play and record. And unfortunately, I got there and I opened the folder and it was the 7 anniversaries. So as sad as it was for me to lose an imaginary set, it was very exciting to realize that, oh, okay, the 7 anniversaries had a bunch of different lives. And so this was really his first time publishing for the piano, because keep in mind, Non Troppo Presto wasn't published until 2011. So this is really his first time trying to publish as a pianist. And so he went through a lot of different forms before he ended up with this idea of anniversaries. I always just took for granted that he knew they were going to be anniversaries from the beginning, but it was far from the truth. Originally in 1942, he went through the idea of having a partita and also this idea of having 6 piano pieces. And I'm kind of glad he ended up with the name Anniversaries, because we have so many wonderful tributes now. But the reason this is so significant to performers of Bernstein is that I had performed the 7 anniversaries several times, but I never really thought about them being Baroque dances. When you're learning Leonard Bernstein, you don't really think to go back to Bach. And what was fascinating is that, like I said, all Baroque dances have very particular structures and meters. Every single piece had that. So for example, Fur Paul Bowles was actually the Passacaglia, and it's marked by a repeating bass line for the entire time, and it does have that. And a sarabande is this very, kind of, for lack of better words, sexy, dark, meant to be a very seductive type of Baroque dance. And for Natalie Kusevitsky was completely in that style and had the correct accentation and everything. But it really did change how I perceived the set, because I really started to think of them as dances rather than just as tributes, which, the first thing you'll think about is, oh, I want to play it like Aaron Copland since it's dedicated for Aaron Copland. So it actually put a whole new perspective on performing as well. And now the good, juicy stuff, the unpublished material for the piano. And so you are going to hear today 7 pieces. And even though I've learned them by heart, I'm actually going to play them from manuscript, because I was talking earlier with Dr. Plyler about this, that and with Mark Horowitz about this, that it really changes your perspective to play from a handwritten manuscript, because it's like reading someone's handwriting. You kind of sometimes see things and you don't see things that you would expect from their personality. So I always just love performing from it because it's a guilty pleasure of mine. But today what you're going to hear is Valse Lente, which is this beautiful under a minute waltz, which is just very romantic in style. Mixolydian Mix-Up, which is also later used in Jubilee games or Concerto for Orchestra, so you'll probably recognize that. It's kind of a fun, bouncy tune. 35 for Zono and Vic, which was an anniversary that never quite made the cut. For Nicholas Slanimsky, this piece has gotten laughs at every concert I've ever done because it is so funny. He hides Happy Birthday and other famous orchestral snippets within the texture, so keep an ear out for that. 1 minute for Charlie Harmon. This is a very dark 1-page piece, but when I asked Charlie about it, he said that it was just written when he couldn't go with Bernstein to a weekend trip. So Bernstein wrote this and sent it to him. And then we're going to now quickly talk about Valse Lente and Meditations Before a Wedding. But before we do that, I want to stress that here in the library, there exists so many other works that are not yet published. And it's really wonderful to just go through and look at some of them. And there's a couple out today. Meditations Over a Prayerful Theme My Father Sang in the Shower 30 Years Ago is out today. So I would encourage you to look at that. But there's everything from 4th grade tears for Nina to other anniversaries that never quite made the cut. So Valse Lente after GAEA is a cryptogram, and I always forget that word, but it's such a cool word. It's so official. And essentially what it means is it's when composers take names and then turn them into musical melodies. So here you see at the top, his friend had a last name G-A-E-A, and underneath it are the notes G-A-E-A, and that, if you read music notation, you can see right there that melody uses those same notes. So the whole piece is based off of this, and this is kind of hearkening back to Bach, who did the same thing, and also to Schumann, who was very famous for that. So listen for that cryptogram today. And then meditations before a wedding. If you were there last night at the concert, you get to hear it again today. But it's a very intense piece, and we didn't really talk about it yesterday, but it was written for his daughter Jamie's wedding. And it really is this father having this issue right before this wedding, and you're going to hear some very dark music, some very beautiful music. Fun little things I want to talk about is that here on this first little example with the Presto that you see, that top line is actually a transcription of a little mechanical bird that he took with him everywhere. So it's kind of like, he's sitting in his study and all of a sudden he decides to just transcribe this little bird chime that he hears. And at the next little image, you'll notice at the very bottom of the screen, it has a little indication of the lyric is not to be sung aloud. And he has this very beautiful text of, love is so easy to say and it's easy to mean, but am I really in love? It's this kind of what is love and what is marriage, this theme that keeps coming back today in all these lectures. But I found it very poignant that it's not to be sung, not only because it's solo piano, but it's like a father that can't necessarily say everything to his daughter, but is really pondering. But of course it ends happily. So I'm going to put this back up so you can keep track of which piece we're on, but without further ado. conclusions that we can draw from all of this information that I'm bringing to you in an excited, frantic state today. So after doing all of this research and writing many, many pages that I want to forget about currently on my dissertation, even though it was such a fun project, was I really discovered a really interesting thing about his compositional process, particularly in regards to when he recycles music. And that when he takes music and he starts it originally with it being a piano score and he turns it into an orchestration, basically he uses all the same musical material, but the notation and articulation is greatly changed. So whenever he took something from the piano and turned it into an orchestrated score, he really basically thought, okay, I need to make sure it's very specific now, since being a solo pianist, you know, you can kind of have a gist of the music and put it out on the piano immediately, whereas if you're 55 people in an orchestra, you may all have very different interpretations. So it requires, as a composer, to have a little bit more of a nitpicky specificity when it comes to making scores and parts, which is partially, but I think also just as he had a chance to grow with the music, he was very nitpicky about exactly what he wanted at any given moment. And Michael Barrett last night talked also about how, you know, sometimes too, as he grew with music, he discovered what he wanted in it as well, and would always change it. Whereas when he took something from the orchestra and he turned it into the piano, what you would expect was true, where a lot of times the notation and articulation never changed. So it showed that he really thought of the piano as a means to an end to get across an orchestral sound. So he didn't hear a piano sound and an orchestra sound. Instead, he thought that the piano could really get across every kind of sound you could get in the orchestra if the pianist was really attuned to the style and the understanding. However, a lot of times he just cut musical material. So a lot of times the piano versions of pieces that started out as orchestrations are very different in terms of what the actual structure is or what you actually see on the page. So now is probably the juiciest backstory I could share with you. I wanted to think about, if all the backstories I could share with you, what would be the juiciest? And this is great because it not only shows the kinds of research that the library allows for, but also the fun historical things that you can start picking out of all of these stories. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with his Symphony No. 1, which was premiered in 1944 and was completed on December 31st, 1942. Now, that date seems very interesting. Well, why was it the last day of the year? Wasn't he enjoying, you know, the holiday with his friends and family? Well, he had just graduated Curtis in 1942, and he was looking for a next stage of his career, something he writes Aaron Copland a lot about what am I going to do? Help me get set up in New York, and Copland tried his best to do so. And he decided that a good next step would be to apply for a composition competition at New England Conservatory. So he thought he would complete the symphony and send it right in. But of course, in typical Bernstein fashion, he was so busy that it ended up becoming a race to the end. And all of his family and friends are documented saying it was crazy with how much editing and copying they had to help him do. And he literally had to hand deliver it to Koussevitzky the night of the deadline. But what was interesting is years later, after the symphony had been premiered, there's a really nice little program note that Bernstein has at the beginning of the symphony. And he talks about a little bit about how he came up with the symphony, and there's a movement called Lamentation. And he said, oh, well, yeah, I picked an earlier sketch, and I decided to build my symphony movement off of this sketch because of what he calls logical concomitance, which I had to look up that word too. But basically, it means that it just, it had some kind of inherent musical relationship, and I had to use this sketch. And for me, I didn't know why, but that just didn't seem to match up with what my research had done. So I went back and I looked, and in August of 1939, there was letter correspondence between Copland and Bernstein. And indeed, Lamentation was not a sketch. It was a complete, fully edited, finalized piece. So Bernstein had kind of changed his story later. So Lamentation was finished in 1939. And unlike what Bernstein said later, it already was written for mezzo-soprano and orchestra, and it was complete. But Bernstein wrote to Copland saying, I know this piece is never going to get performed because it's odd, so it's going to have to find its place somewhere in a larger piece. But let me know what you think about it because this piece is very special to me. So I found that that was very interesting that, later he didn't want to admit it, but he knew all along that this piece was going to have to end up somewhere bigger in order to have its performance, which showed just how astute he was of understanding the musical scene at the time. But what was interesting is he said that, some things were greatly changed. And I like, well, what was greatly changed about it? So I went back to Lamentation, and it's literally a verbatim usage of Lamentation, save for one or two small things. So the only major change is that he actually combines Lamentation with another complete score, which comes from 1942, known as For Natalie Kusevitsky. Today, that's how we know it. It's part of the 7th anniversary set, which had also gone through the partita and the 6th piano. See, all of a sudden you see all of these things were going on at the same time. But what I found so juicy about this is not only did he, finish this symphony by combining these two pieces very advantageously to get the deadline, but he did it so seamlessly, and it sounds incredible. So it shows also just his musicianship, but also his little bit of social savvy in that Kusevitsky was a judge on the panel. So what better way to reach the heartstrings of somebody than to say, hey, this beautiful tribute that I wrote for your wife is now incorporated into what I know will become one of my greatest symphonies. So there were so many parts moving into just this one piece, and that's the kind of stuff that the library collection allows you to do, is through letters and different manifestations of pieces, you can come up with these amazing stories and see the real truths behind these pieces versus just what you might quickly get from a Wikipedia Google. So in conclusion, I just want to talk about Bernstein really has a significant amount of repertoire for the piano, a lot of which we didn't even cover today, but I wanted to show you my favorite things at least. And all of it is extremely pianistic and revealing of the time. So there's really no reason why it shouldn't be performed all the time. And again, just to emphasize how much this archive has really given to me, and I hope it will give to all of you, in terms of just having a new, fresh perspective on what you know about the 20th century art scene. And I would just personally argue that this all makes a case for, and my dissertation makes a case for, that this repertoire needs to be performed more, because I think that hopefully you had the same experience. It's really fun to listen to. It is very engaging, and I think that there are creative ways that we can start programming and teaching it, because just even beyond music, I think it's an important part of history for any history major or American to really understand where our culture comes from. And since this is an academic lecture, there's just a quick bibliography for you to take a gander at. But I just want to thank you all for listening today and for being part of this. If just a little bit about me, just so you're aware, I do have a CD out with all of the works of Leonard Bernstein. So if you liked the unpublished works you heard today and can't get a score yet since they're still only here, you can always listen to them on the CD. And I'm always happy to answer any questions. I think there will be a question and answer segment now, so.
Did he write on the, is this on?
Yeah.
Did he write on the same piano at home? Because I know it was mentioned last night that he kind of, in the wintertime, did the composing piece and summertime traveled to conduct. But did he use the same piano at home, and does that exist?
So right now in the National Jewish Museum that I mentioned, they have one of the pianos that he had, which was the famous piano from his aunt. And the story is that, it was brought into his home and the young Bernstein reached up to the keys and the heavens opened up, that whole story. So that piano was kind of the most famous Bernstein piano, and that still exists, although it's not played anymore. There's a lot of different pianos that are attributed to Bernstein. One that I rehearsed on all week with the cast from last night, which exists in the Leonard Bernstein penthouse, is a piano that he just kind of had for rehearsals and for fun. And oddly enough, it was signed by Alicia Keys. So if you want to see that, you can check out my Instagram. I had a chuckle over that. But so there are many different pianos, but there are a couple that are more famously attributed to him. He's running.
Thanks. So I have a question, technicality, about you're describing unpublished works and performing them. What is the relationship? Can you come and take a picture of the works and then perform it, or how
Good
do you
question.
get to perform unpublished works?
It
What's
was a
the process?
very long process, which in retrospect always seems like fate. Because it was just through, years ago, speaking of Songfest, which a lot of you heard in the last lecture, that was the first major piece by Bernstein I ever played. And I was working on it with all people with Michael Barrett. And that's when we first met, and all of a sudden there was this amazing collaboration. I realized how much I love Bernstein. And just throughout the years, I started getting very much into his music, and we started working together. And all of a sudden, it started becoming my research area. But no, it's a lot of copyright, a lot of special Bernstein estate rights that went into just even this presentation alone today. And it's with a lot of things here in the library. So that's why this library is so special, is that you can actually see all this stuff and hold it, because a lot of this stuff it's very slow in the process of getting everything out to the public for many different reasons. But it's a very long, complicated process for me to have gotten the works to perform them and record them. But I'm very grateful for it. Read my dissertation, yes. So the question is, why have the works not been published? There's a variety of factors. Some of them were lost until recently, just because if you look at the collection, there's piles and piles of papers. And some of these pieces are sandwiched in between the middle of stacks of papers that he has. Some of them just didn't make it because it didn't seem to fit in any collection, like the meditation that's out today. It didn't really fit in any kind of publication set, and it'd be pretty expensive to publish a 3 or 4 page piece alone. Some of them are attributed to not being in his style, so they don't feel it's appropriate to publish them, at least not yet. And some of them are in shorthand, so it's taking time to really prove that they're complete before we publish them.
Thanks so much for this research. I guess you were touching on this, but I'd like to hear you talk about what does Bernstein's piano music add to our picture of him as a composer? How does it fill out our sense of his style or him as an artist that, say, the symphonies, the operas don't?
Yeah, well, to me, what it really showed is, first of all, what a tremendous performer he was. I mean, I know that's kind of silly to say, but, we think about him as a conductor and a leader, but, when I've been doing research, there's really not that many recordings of him performing piano. There are with him doing, Rhapsody in Blue or Ravel Concerto, but we don't really see him just sitting down and playing a Beethoven sonata or something by Chopin. And what's engaging about it is that there's a lot of research that's been done about pianists as performer composers. And that a lot of times when you play an instrument, when you're writing, it's very easy to fall in the trap of just playing whatever your fingers kind of go to on autopilot. So for example, a lot of composers like Rachmaninoff, he writes what he can feel on the piano, and that's why it's so pianistic. Whereas composers like Beethoven or Brahms, a lot of their music is actually very pianistically hard to play. Even though they were themselves great pianists, they were on a very different thinking level of not just writing what their fingers kind of led them to, but thinking on a more orchestral level, for lack of a better adjective. So to me, what this adds is, first of all, a lot of missing historical timelines, especially with the reusage. We just kind of basically started touching on it, but almost every major work that he has that, for orchestra has its origins in piano music. And so when we understand the historical chronology of how they got used for that, we actually really fill in the dots about how he composes, how he reuses, why he reuses things musically. So I would say that if you don't want to look at it just from a pianistic standpoint, it's really more on learning his compositional process and how he actually creates larger structures in music.
Hello.
Hi.
First of all, I really enjoyed listening to you last night. You're an excellent pianist.
Thank you.
You seem to play with such ease, just like he did. But it's very complicated, difficult music, I've discovered. So my question is, did he have a favorite key? Did you find that he tended towards a certain modality?
That's a really good question. I never even thought about that. So I can't say that I have an answer for you right now, but you've definitely given me a next thing to look into. I would say, though, the thing that I noticed is that he actually tried to avoid keys. Like, not that things aren't in keys, but that a lot of times what was so hard about when I first started getting into his music is that a lot of it is a very unique type of tonality where he kind of bridges between several keys at once. And within one measure, you're all of a sudden in a new tonality or in a new key center. And so I would say that I'll have to do a little bit more sleuthing into that, but what's so great about his music is that you don't get stuck in a key a lot of the times. So I think we're out of time, but again, I just want to thank all of you today, and I look forward to talking with you.